I always take the same train at the same time every day. There's not much room for surprises when you follow a routine. I sit by the window, put on my headphones, and watch the city pass by. By now, I know the order of the stations by heart, which ones take longer, and even the regulars who get on and off at each stop. That night, everything seemed the same, until I started noticing a few things out of place. The train car was a lot emptier than usual. Maybe it was just the time, but even the lights seemed dimmer, flickering every now and then. I didn't think much of it. It was probably just the exhaustion talking. After a long day, all I wanted was to get home, nothing more. But then the train took a turn. It wasn't anything drastic, just a slight change in direction, but I noticed. It wasn't the usual route. I furrowed my brow for a second, thinking it might be a detour because of some construction or something like that. I didn't worry, but you know that feeling when something small nags at the back of your mind? I kept looking out the window, trying to shake off the strange feeling that was creeping in. After that strange turn, the train kept going, but what I saw out the window started making me uneasy. The familiar sight of buildings and well-lit streets was replaced by something different. Instead of seeing the city I knew, everything outside looked emptier, like we were passing through an abandoned industrial area. It felt odd, but I figured it might just be a temporary detour. That happens sometimes, right? Construction, maintenance, or something like that. But the problem was that the uneasy feeling wasn't going away. In fact, it was growing stronger. The stations we passed were different too. None of the names were ones I recognized. And the strangest part? The train didn't stop at any of them. It just kept going, speeding past, and I started wondering where exactly it was taking me. With each station that we didn't stop at, my discomfort grew. I didn't know any of these places. It felt like we were heading deeper into an isolated area, far away from everything. That's when I decided to look around the train car, hoping to find some reassurance. Maybe someone else was noticing how strange this was too. But the car was empty. Completely empty. The few people I had seen at the start of the ride were gone. I couldn't even remember seeing anyone get off. That made the feeling of unease turn into something much harder to ignore. I tried to stay calm. There had to be a logical explanation, right? Maybe I was just so tired that I was imagining things. I grabbed my phone to check the map and see exactly where the train was headed. But when I opened the app, there was no signal. No internet, no GPS, nothing. I swiped the screen a few times trying to force it to work, but the phone was practically dead. That only made me more anxious. I stood up and started pacing the train car. It wasn't very big, but I needed to move to find someone. I walked to the end of the car and looked through the windows into the next one, but the view was the same, empty. No sign of a conductor or any other passengers. I stood there for a few seconds, staring down the corridor, wondering how this could be happening. The sound of the train on the tracks, which I usually found kind of comforting, now felt way too loud, like it was echoing inside my head. I went back to my seat, trying not to panic. I even tried opening the door between the cars, but of course it was locked. The feeling of being trapped started to creep in, like the space around me was closing in. I sat down again, eyes fixed on the window, trying to make sense of everything. But the further the train went, the stronger the feeling grew that something very strange was going on. With every passing minute, the feeling that I was being taken far away from everything I knew grew stronger. The stations went by, one after another, but the train didn't stop at any of them. It was like it was racing along an endless track, and I had no idea where it would end. The strangest part was the landscape outside. Everything looked more desolate with each passing second. No cities, no houses, just abandoned industrial areas and darkness. I found myself staring out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of something familiar, something that would tell me I was on the right path. But that never happened. I tried opening the window, banging on the glass, anything that might give me the sense of control again. But it was useless. Everything was locked, sealed tight, and I felt more powerless with each second. The train kept going full speed, and I was trapped inside, alone. My mind was racing. How was I going to get out of this? What was happening with this train? Fear started creeping in, a mix of anxiety and frustration. I couldn't think straight. It felt like time had frozen, yet the train kept moving, taking me somewhere, and I had no idea where that was. Finally, the train began to slow down. The initial relief I felt quickly shifted to a new kind of apprehension as I looked outside. The station where it stopped was completely unfamiliar. There were no name signs, no signs of life, just empty structures and flickering lights, like the place had been abandoned long ago. The train doors opened slowly, but I remained seated, hesitant. Where would I go? Should I get off or stay? My body couldn't decide. Outside, the unknown beckoned, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to face whatever came next. I was on the train heading home late at night. It had been a long, exhausting day, and I was nearly drifting off with the gentle rocking of the tracks. The car was relatively empty, just a few scattered passengers, each in their own little world. I alternated between gazing at the dark outside and lightly dozing off. Suddenly, the train came to an abrupt stop. One of those stops you're not expecting, you know? I straightened up in my seat, a bit confused, and looked out the window. We were at a station that, at first glance, seemed completely abandoned. No signs indicating the name of the place, and everything was dark. The strangest part? An old, rusted train car, sitting on the adjacent tracks. Its windows were shattered, and it looked like it had been left there for years. For some reason, I decided to get off. I'm not sure if it was curiosity or just the need to stretch my legs, but I stood up and made my way to the train door. When I stepped onto the cold platform, an eerie silence took over. Only the wind sliced through the air, rustling some dry leaves on the ground. There was no one else there. Just me, the train, and that old, abandoned car. I stood there for a while, just staring at that train car. The more I looked, the more I noticed how run down it was. Rust covered the sides, the windows were shattered, and even some plants had started growing around it like no one had touched it in years. That thing had no reason to be there, it seemed completely out of place. But something inside me was pulling me closer. I walked slowly toward the car, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. The wind was light but cold, making the place feel even more desolate. As I got closer, I noticed strange marks on the rusty doors, like they'd been forced open at some point. That's when I heard a noise. It sounded like it came from inside the car. A low sound, but just enough to make my heart race a little. Maybe it was just the wind blowing through the cracks, I tried to convince myself. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Something was inside. It wasn't the wind. My body tensed up, and a quick thought flashed through my mind: I should get back on the train, now. I glanced back toward the train, and the doors were still open. That unsettling feeling only grew stronger. It wasn't exactly fear, but something deep inside told me I needed to get out of there. I turned to head back to the train, but just as I did, the doors began to close. My heart raced. Without a second thought, I started running. Every step seemed to echo too loudly in the silence of the station. The noise from the abandoned train car also seemed to grow louder, as if something inside was moving faster, matching my pace. I didn't know what it was, and honestly, I didn't want to find out. I just wanted to get on the train before it was too late. I ran as fast as I could, the seconds dragging on. The doors were nearly closed by the time I got there. In the last moment, I threw myself through the gap, the air rushing out of my lungs from the effort. The doors clicked shut behind me. Gasping for breath, I felt a strange pull to look back outside through the dirty windows. There, standing beside the abandoned train car, was something, or someone. It was hard to make out exactly what it was because the train lights flickered slightly as we began to move. But I swear I saw a shadow, still and unmoving, watching as the train slowly pulled away. I stepped back from the window, trying to process what had just happened. The train was already picking up speed, and the station was disappearing from view. I was safe now, right? But that image, that shadow left me with a strange, lingering unease. I sat down, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake that eerie feeling. Sitting in my seat, I was still trying to make sense of what had just happened. The train continued moving forward at a steady pace, and the sound of the tracks should have been comforting, but it wasn't. My mind was racing, and the image of that shadow beside the abandoned train car wouldn't leave me. I looked around. The car was empty, just me and the distant hum of the train in motion. The silence felt different now, heavier, and every little noise seemed louder than it actually was. The occasional creak of the train, something I'd never even noticed before, now made me uneasy. Each sound felt like a reminder that, no matter how normal things seemed, something was off. I turned back to the window, trying to push away the thought that I had seen something. The deserted station was far behind, but the growing sense of unease stayed with me. I began to question whether what I saw had really been there or if it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the rush had exaggerated everything. Maybe I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger hadn't been left behind. It lingered like a shadow following close behind. When the train finally stopped at the next station, I got up quickly. Stepping off, I felt the cool night air hit me, but the unease still clung to me. I walked along the platform trying to shake off whatever that feeling was. Before leaving, I glanced back at the train one last time. For a split second, I saw something move in the reflection of the window. My heart raced again. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and left as fast as I could, silently promising myself I would never get off a train at an abandoned station again. I was exhausted when I boarded the train that night. It wasn't a long ride, but after a full day of work, it felt like the journey home had doubled in distance. I found a seat by the window as usual, and let my eyes wander around the car. The train was fuller than I expected. A few people were dozing off, heads resting against the windows, while others were glued to their phone screens, probably scrolling through social media or watching videos to pass the time. It was a typical scene for that time of night. Everyone seemed tired, too drained for any interaction. A peaceful ride just the way I liked it. I gazed out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance as the train began to pick up speed. I was used to that feeling of relaxation that came as soon as the train started moving. Everything seemed normal, a routine trip that I made almost every day. Out of nowhere, the train slammed on its brakes so hard that I was nearly thrown forward. I felt my body jolt with the impact, and by reflex, I grabbed the side of the seat to steady myself. A few things fell to the floor, and the people around me tried to regain their composure, clearly caught off guard. The abrupt stop was strong enough to put everyone in the car on high alert. The silence that followed was unsettling. No one said anything. There were no shouts, no murmurs, not even the sound of an announcement over the intercom. Just the creaking of the train car, stuck in the middle of the tracks. That made me uneasy. I kept waiting for the familiar sound of a voice explaining what was going on, but nothing came. I lifted my head and looked around. Some passengers were visibly confused, others restless, peering out the windows to try and figure out what was happening. But overall, the car was steeped in a kind of silent confusion. No one knew what was going on, and the train remained still as if something serious had just happened. After a few minutes of the train being completely still, there was still no sign of movement or explanation. I tried to distract myself, but something caught my eye. The car ahead of mine, which I was sure had been full when I boarded, now looked completely empty. I hadn't seen anyone leave and no one had passed by me. It didn't make any sense. I leaned forward in my seat, trying to get a better look through the window connecting the cars. It was dark, but not so much that I couldn't tell there was no one left. That made me uneasy. People don't just vanish, right? But here I was, staring at an empty car that had been full just minutes before, and there wasn't a single person in sight. I kept staring for a few more seconds, waiting for some sign of movement, but there was nothing. The strangeness of the situation only deepened, especially after the abrupt stop. No one else around me seemed to notice what I was seeing. Everyone was wrapped up in their own world, like they'd decided that trying to understand what was happening was worse than ignoring it. Now, beyond the uncomfortable silence, time seemed to drag on, and the lack of information was making me more anxious by the minute. After what felt like an eternity, the train finally started moving again, but in an oddly slow manner. It wasn't the smooth, steady motion from before, it was more like it was creeping forward cautiously, as if testing the tracks. The sound from the rails was different too, a metallic screech that echoed through the car like something was wrong underneath. By this point, my mind was racing. Why had the train stopped like that? And why was the car ahead empty? I tried to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The fact that there had been no communication from the conductor made everything feel even more off. As the train continued its slow crawl, the sense that something could happen at any moment took over. I kept glancing toward the empty car ahead, then out the window, but all I could see was darkness. Every meter the train traveled seemed to add to the tension. I started wondering what would happen if the train stopped again. Was something wrong with the tracks? Were we heading toward an accident? These questions began to weigh heavily on my mind. The silence, combined with the strange, slow progress, only amplified my growing unease. The train began to pick up speed, leaving behind the strange, slow rhythm from earlier. Gradually, it seemed like everything was returning to normal. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my thoughts, but the abrupt stop and the prolonged silence still weighed heavily on my mind. As we approached the next station, I noticed something that made me uneasy. There were several railway workers scattered across the platform, all with serious expressions, talking among themselves. Some were pointing at the tracks, clearly discussing something important. There was still no announcement about what had happened, and the train didn't stop at the station. It only slowed down enough for me to catch a glimpse of the tension on their faces. It wasn't until I finally got off at my stop that I started to feel some relief. Physically, I was safe, but my mind was still stuck on those moments inside the train. I couldn't help but wonder what had really happened back on the tracks. Had we narrowly avoided an accident? Was it a technical issue? I would never know for sure. The train continued on its way and I headed home, but the thought that something far more serious could have happened stayed with me. As I walked home, everything looked the same, but I knew that my next train ride would never feel the same again.